I'm Jill Lloyd, an art historian, and I'm going to be speaking today with Michael Peppiatt, who was a close friend of Francis Bacon from 1963 until his death. So they were close friends for over 30 years. And I think it was a very special kind of friendship in the sense that it was personal, a close personal friendship. But Michael is also a well-known critic and curator, specializing in post-war British and French art. At present, he's writing a biography of Giacometti, or not exactly a biography, but a book about Giacometti's studio. But I'm going to talk to him today about Francis Bacon. Michael is perhaps best known for his groundbreaking biography of Francis Bacon, Anatomy of an Enigma, which I have here. Some of you may know it already. And I'm going to really talk to Michael today about the personal relationship with Francis Bacon. And our talk is entitled How Francis Bacon Changed My Life. So, Michael, I wonder if you could begin by telling us a little bit about how you came to meet Francis Bacon and what impression he made on you at the beginning.
Sure, with pleasure. Can everybody hear? Is it clear? We'll be drowned out, of course. Whenever a goal is scored, we'll know all about it. Anyway, I'll try and score a goal or two beforehand. I was a student. I was an adolescent, basically, studying at Cambridge in England. And I decided to do an issue of a magazine that we had there called Cambridge Opinion. And I was rather short of ideas, and since nobody was talking about it, I thought, what about an issue on modern art in Britain? We're talking about 1963 here, so modern art in Britain was a very, very restricted kind of category. We had a few, we had Henry Moore, we had Francis Bacon. So I went along to London, to Soho, and asked whether I could interview Francis Bacon. And I had an introduction to a photographer whom some of you might know called John Deakin, who did very grainy close-up shots. We've got one of them here of the people who interested him, artists in particular. And John's photos were in fact incorporated by Francis into his work because he liked to have portraits, photos of people when he did portraits. And so anyway, I went into this pub. I was 18, 19. It was all very noisy, very smoky, very boozy. And I said timidly, does anybody here know John Deakin? So suddenly this little man turned around on a stool and said, you're talking to the great photographer, my dear. And I said, is there any chance of meeting Francis Bacon? He said, I don't know about that, now that she's become so famous, whether she could be bothered to meet a student like you. So he went on like this, and then suddenly, somewhere along the bar, this man with a very wide face and a very alert gaze whipped round and said, now what's the old fool saying now? Of course I'd like to meet a student. Where is he? I was sort of produced, and he sort of thrust a glass of something into my hand. Is it too loud?
No, I was just asking for the next photograph.
I might be booming.
Yeah,
and,
this is Michael as a young man.
We met,
Bacon.
we got on very quickly. We went out and had a marvelous fish lunch at a fish restaurant in Wheelers, drank too much Chablis. That's always a keynote with Francis. You always drank too much. The friendship began there and really lasted, as Jill said, until Francis died in 1992. And this photograph, it's one of the few, unfortunately, that I have with him, was taken by David Hockney in around 1975, 74, 75, when he had a studio. There we go. He had a studio in Paris. And we'd just been out to lunch together, and we called in on Hockney, and Hockney did a couple of Polaroids with us. So Bacon here would have been about, this is 75, he would have been about mid to late 40s. And as you can see, he's a very sort of, no, I've got that wrong, haven't I? It's much older than that. He was mid-60s, mid to late 60s. And I think you'll see that, he's obviously still in the fleur de l'âge. He's still very vivid and youthful and energetic. And that was one of the extraordinary things about him, is that he radiated a kind of energy. But then you should ask me a question, because otherwise I could just go on.
Well, it's great listening, but there was this big age difference between you. Do you think there was something of a father-son relationship between you?
Yes. I think I was looking for a father figure in the way that, some young men and young women do. And I met this, I'd never met anybody remotely comparable to this man, because he was very, very free, very self-confident, very charming, extremely amiable. This is the sort of thing I think people don't, knowing his paintings, they don't imagine that he would be such a wonderful kind of companion, very funny, very supportive when he liked you. When he didn't like you, that was another story. But when he liked you, he was always there for you. He was simply a very marvelous person. There was another less amiable side, but can't even remember what the question was now.
No, I asked, whether father-son, but in your
yes,
biography...
He was somebody, in a sense, he took me under his wing.
In your biography, in the introduction, you say that he was both a magnetic and a controlling personality. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that. You just began to talk about the sort of two sides to Bacon.
He was one of those people, I've often sort of struggled to find a good phrase for it, but I would say, in a nutshell, if you were talking about Bacon, you could say that when he came in somewhere, the temperature went up, wherever it was. In a bar, very often in a restaurant, in a room, here, there was a sort of added vitality. And because of that, I think he attracted a lot of people, all kinds of people who were attracted by the force of his personality, and of course the force of the painting, because when you talk about Bacon, you're talking about two forces, the force of the man himself and the force of the work, which of course combine to make a very, very powerful mix indeed. And at the same time, yes, he did control. He appeared to be enormously free and sort of not caring about what happened to him or to his career. But at the same time, he was an extraordinary strategist, in a sense. He was always planning how to go from one level to another. He had very, very clear ideas, I think, about his career, and he was very, very controlling about what one wrote about him. I had the misfortune to write an entire book, which he encouraged, and then at the 11th hour, just as it was about to be published, he asked me, as a friend, not to publish it. So what could I do but put it away in a drawer for several years. So he did control.
Perhaps we'll have the next slide, please. When I think you were explaining that these photographs were taken by David Hockney in Paris. Can you tell us how you came to be with Bacon in Paris?
Well, it just carried on. I went to live in Paris in the mid-60s, and since for Bacon it was his favorite city, and he always thought, because I suppose he really measured himself against Picasso always, and so Picasso, it was Picasso's hometown, and he was a great admirer of French culture generally, and a great lover of the city of Paris. And so when I moved there, I used to see him all the time whenever he came over, and he came over frequently. And I also found him a studio there, so he began to live and work frequently in Paris.
Did you go to exhibitions together, or?
We did. We went everywhere together. I mean, it was, he was a very much a bon vivant. So it was a lot of eating and drinking, a lot of restaurants, clubs, night spots, whatever, openings, things like that. But we did go to several exhibitions together, yes. He had a very, very good eye for, it was marvelous going around museums with him, because he'd just pick out a couple of works and say one or two things, and it really did help you to see. An example of that that comes to mind is we were in Castres together in the sort of southeast of France, down in the Midi, and where that marvelous big painting of Goya, La Junta, the Philippine sort of parliament. And he said, what's extraordinary about this picture, because they're all sort of tiny figures like that, is that Goya has managed to convey the feeling of air passing between all the people. And of course, that suddenly brought the whole picture to life.
Yeah, definitely. And did you meet, what sort of people did you meet when you were with Bacon, through Bacon? I mean, what sort of circles did he mix in?
Mixed in every circle from high to low, often very quickly. So you'd go from sort of champagne at the Ritz to some sort of pretty alarming dive wherever you happen to be with him. And he continued, all sorts of people came to him. Francis was a great leveler in the sense that all people were just human beings. He could be as charming with a duchess as with a cleaning lady. I remember he came to my flat and there was a Spanish lady who was doing some cleaning. They got on like a house on fire. He's just had this thing for other people. They felt attracted to him by his vitality, by his intelligence and by his charm. He just sort of sparked off all kinds of unlikely relationships. So when you were with him, you met you met big figures, people like Lucian Freud, or poets, or other writers, other intellectuals, Michel Leiris, I don't know, a whole litany of names. But you also met people that he sort of just picked up one way or the other in bars and so on. So, who were often very interesting, quite as interesting in their own right. Mm-hmm. So it was a complete sort of panorama.
Okay. I guess his boyfriend, George Dyer, would have been an example of, one of the people that he'd picked up along the way. But you actually were there in 1971 when the 71, 72 when the Grand Palais retrospective took place and Dyer committed suicide.
Yes, that was a very, very difficult moment. Do you want the?
Yes, perhaps we could have the next one, please.
Bacon had a tumultuous life generally, and in his private life, he had several tragedies. And this was the second big tragedy that was about to happen. This is a little time before it did happen. Was that he would attract all these people, and some of them, in an odd way, couldn't do without him. He drew them in and gave them a kind of new personality because he had so much instinct about people. And of course, that's very dangerous if you don't have a fairly solidly constructed personality yourself. You can just be sort of sucked in. Mm. And George was a very amiable, although he was a crook. He was a sort of criminal who'd done time for theft, for doing this, for doing that. But he was brought up in the East End where, as Francis used to say, well, that's what people expect of you when you're brought up in that environment. It's sort of like a trade. You go out and you steal. That's what they did. But George kept getting caught, which was inconvenient because he kept getting longer prison sentences. And so Bacon gave him enough money for him not to need to steal. And later he regretted that very much because he said, I took away his reason for being in the end, because while he had that, he had a purpose. But once he just had the money, he'd just go out and get completely drunk all day long and became really a nuisance. He was always staggering around, and I liked him very much. He was something very, very attractive and rather very vulnerable about him. But he did have a very, very weak point, and I think when Francis grew tired of him and he wanted to move on, he didn't want to continue their close relationship, George grew desperate, and He tried to commit suicide several times before, and one way or the other, he'd been saved. Francis had got him to hospital in time. This time he was out opening this huge exhibition that he had at the Grand Palais in Paris in '71. And just as he'd opened the show and, all the fanfare, the Prime Minister, the President, this, that, and the other had come past, somebody from the hotel came rushing up and said, Mr. Bacon, I've got some terrible news. Your friend has just been found dead in the hotel room. So this was Bacon's life, he thought of himself very much as singled out to suffer, in a way, to live the extremes of life. And of course, he did. And I think you sense that in the paintings, that he called it having one's sensibility stretched as far as it could go. So he went from these marvelous highs of having recognition in the place where he'd always wanted to be recognized, in Paris, where his hero Picasso had been the idol, was still the idol, and he'd had something of that recognition, which for him, and coming from the French, he thought of as a real kind of accolade, a genuine accolade. So to have that and then be plunged into all the the dreadful, the loss, all the sordid details of reporting a suicide and so on was, and I sat with him through a lot of the time we talked, and he just said, there it is, my life's always been a tragedy.
There's another quotation in your book from an earlier relationship he had with Peter Lacey, who was, I think, his first very serious relationship, wasn't it? And Peter is quoted as saying, "You ruined my life, you ruined it completely by making me think about myself the whole time." And I just wondered, is this something very specific to his intimate relationships, or was there an element of that in all his friendships?
Absolutely, that's spot on. Francis made you very self-conscious. You suddenly felt it was like going in and suddenly having a very, very piercing eye. Well, it wasn't like, it was having a very, very piercing couple of eyes turned on you, and they just seemed to x-ray you down to the bone. It was quite uncomfortable because what he wanted, I think, was to get to the heart of things, to get to the nub, to get to the core, as soon as he could, of anything, of anybody, any picture, any experience. And I can see that for somebody like George, for anybody, in short doses, that is possible. But I would think as a sort of close companion, it would be totally intolerable.
Yeah, definitely.
And so he was always boring with these eyes, boring into you to see, when you talk, to see whether you were telling the whole story. He wanted the whole story. He wanted the whole story as quickly and as accurately as he possibly could.
Have the next one, please. So, self-portrait of Francis Bacon. I mean, I guess he was pretty merciless with himself as well.
Absolutely. He said, I remember he said, one is never hard enough on oneself. He said, we're all very, very sort of too easygoing with ourselves. And he pushed himself to absolute limits. I mean, first of all, a lot of the legend is actually true. I know that for a fact. He did sleep an hour and a half, 2 hours a night. He'd be out until 5 or 6 in the morning and up again at 6 or 7, beginning to sort of rummage around the studio with an absolute sort of waterfall of drink inside him. It wasn't just that he didn't sleep. He was coping with sort of industrial amounts of alcohol. So he had all this going on, and yet he was both very free and, loved to what he called drift. But at the same time, he was absolutely terrifically self-disciplined. So he wouldn't miss a morning's painting. He would always be in the studio trying to sort of grapple with the canvas and grapple with his hangover and grapple with, his whole state of mind and try and push things forward. And it was remarkable. And then he seemed afterwards, he could be very relaxed, after this big struggle to try and sort of pierce the fumes and pierce, to get an image down. And very often he painted when he was very drunk. Not often, because he often took things too far, and they just sort of disintegrated. They just sort of became too thick with paint.
I mean,
But he liked to take things right to the edge. I mean, you see in this portrait, I mean, it's almost, another twist, and it's sort of, what's odd is that it's very, very highly distorted and terrifically like him. I mean, unlike, I have to say, sometimes with Giacometti, you wonder who this can be. Is it Annette? Is it Caroline? Is it Diego? Is it David Sylvester? Even though David Sylvester you tended to see from the actual sort of silhouette. But with Francis, you know right away it's George, it's Lucian Freud, it's Isabel Rawsthorne, it's Henrietta Morez. For some odd reason, within the distortion, he caught some sort of key to the appearance.
Did you talk with him a lot about his painting? I mean, was he...
Oh, yes. Yes, that was, in a sense, that was the main theme, because I was interested in him. Obviously, I was interested in him as a man, as a friend, as a kind of force in my life. Because all this time, of course, I was receiving all these things, and for a young man who just sort of, as somebody called me, an obscure young man, it was very sort of formative to have all that sort of thrown at you. But I was particularly, as a writer on art, I was particularly interested about his whole creative process. I was fascinated by the studio. Sometimes he let me go in, and I didn't rummage around. I didn't have to, because it was all sort of kind of, moving as you stood there, often sort of almost knee-high in images, and discarded this as things, and, rags and brushes and paint. So... what was the question?
But you did used to talk about his work in the studio. Would he show you things?
Not very much, not very much. He was very private about his work. You didn't see him actually at it, You were allowed to go into the studio, and occasionally he'd have me come round for a drink or something like that before we went out for dinner, and he said, I don't know what, he'd be very sort of offhand, very deferential, just sort of say, I don't know what you think of this, and a rather 19th century gesture, he'd have a sort of sheet over it, and he'd sort of, pull the sheet back, and you'd get some terrifying new image.
Did he ever think of painting you?
Yes, he did. That was a sort of game that went on for a long time. He said to me, you were so much better looking before you had that beard. And it became a bit of a cat and mouse thing, because I actually thought, I regret it now, of course, I actually thought that I might shave off the beard, which would have been a kind of concession, not to say capitulation, because he kept saying, it's much more natural. And I said, no, it's not more natural. More natural to have the beard rather than keep shaving it off. So we had this game going on, and I stubbornly and stupidly decided not to shave it off, so I didn't do the portrait, because I sort of suspected I'd shave it off and then, take 1,000 photos or something, and he'd still not do it. But he probably would have done. He probably would have done. He was a very, very generous man. This is the sort of thing that I think, he was hugely, hugely helpful to his friends, to the people he liked. He'd be the first person, if he knew somebody was in need of, real things, he'd go around with a wad of cash and sort of say, I know you need this, and just put it straight into their hands, or pick up a bill for somebody, or if they were in some kind of legal scrape, introduce them to some big lawyer that he knew. He was always there for his friends, although he was very tough on his friends, and could be at his most cruel when you got very close to him. You didn't want to get too close too often, because suddenly he would defend himself with very unusual weapons.
Yeah. I mean, for such a vital man, it must have been quite difficult, the aging process for him.
Oh, yes.
And
yes,
you knew
indeed.
him over this very long period of time. I mean, how did things change as he got older?
Well, he got crankier, in a word. He did get cranky. He hated growing old. He couldn't stand it. He said it's like some ghastly disease, He said, you just... But he fought it. He fought it with all that sort of energy and all that sort of discipline, so that he sort of disciplined himself to stay young. So he would never sort of take care, well, I think he did take care of himself medically, but he would never sort of spare himself. He'd always stay out. He'd always be the one having the extra drink, you know, or fooling around more than he should, you know, picking somebody up and taking them back and probably getting beaten up and, you know, even when he was an old man. So he, you know, he aged disgracefully and I have to say, really, rather miraculously.
I remember, you know, I met him towards the end of his life as well, and, you know, at that time he had a very young boyfriend in his 30s, and I was thinking, you know, obviously you're not homosexual. How did he relate to men that were not gay?
Well, he liked that. He liked what he would call what's called heterosexual men, because secretly he believed all men are homosexual. He'd say things like, or at least he doesn't think he's homosexual, but obviously he is. So I think part of the play was that he always thought that he liked to seduce heterosexual men. So with us, there was a game that went on, but he would never, he was far too grand, as it were, to make a clumsy move. He would wait until somebody made a move towards him.
Right.
So
if you didn't make the move...
If you didn't make a move, then the tension remained and the game went on. He was infinitely seductive, and he used every form of seduction known to man or woman. But you know, sometimes these things work, sometimes they don't.
It's a gambling game.
It was a gamble. He liked the gamble in everything.
How would you sum up the effect that Bacon had on you when you look back at the friendship? I mean, is it something that's still very present in your life now?
I think it must be. I think, you know, if one's lucky enough, I mean, I won't say it's all luck, because meeting somebody like that really has a lasting impact, which I don't know whether it doesn't have a lot of negative sides. I think inevitably it does. You know, I mean, I've had to grow up and to some extent grow out of Bacon, I would say. I mean, I'm trying to analyze that. It's a very big question. I haven't really given it that much thought, but I think I'm as old now, I would think, as he was when I met him. So in a sense, I've reached a sort of, you know, a kind of parallel point. And I think I've had to occasionally, well, my life has changed a great deal, and I think I've, not necessarily consciously, but I've taken some distance, because obviously he was another character. He was another, I absorbed a lot from him, but I think a lot of it I've absorbed and no longer sort of factor in. So I think part of him has been absorbed and factored in, and other parts have been factored out. But there's no doubt that he changed my life.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. That's really marvelous. And I just want, maybe there are questions that people might have for Michael. Yes, please.
Okay. My question is, you spoke about the way when he met someone, he would question him to a very deep level, to understand in a way what made him tick, right? What made him
tick?
Yeah.
I think.
So I want to know in Bacon's life, what made him tick? What caused him to go through this
that's a very
path?
good question. I think he was hugely ambitious, hugely driven. I think, you know, he wasn't unaware. He'd never have said it. He never had admitted it, but I think he was nevertheless aware that he was very unusually gifted, even though he had a very tough time, which is one of the reasons he was nice to young people like me. He'd had a very tough time when he was young and unknown. He'd had to struggle a great deal because, you know, with that kind of imagery, when it broke out, just after the war, nobody wanted to give him a second thought. You know, it was like, we've had all the horror. We don't need horror. You know, we need nice still lives of, you know, fruit and flowers and things like that. We don't need screaming mouths. I think he was, so he was aware of his talents and possibly aware of a mission. He was a driven man. There's no doubt about that. I think he was driven to express a vision he had of life because he thought of life as both marvelous and horrible.
But still, I'll proceed a little bit because what I'm asking is, do you know something like from his personal, very personal story that caused him to, because it's not only an idea, comes from a very deep place that causes someone to go on this certain path and need to express this kind of expression.
I think if you could explain that, you could explain, I mean, it's a very leading question. If you could explain that, you could explain him entirely and you could explain his painting entirely, and I'm not sure I could do that or anybody could do that, but I think he wanted to he was driven to try and make a new language. He wanted to find a way of releasing these terrible tensions within himself. I think he was in deep conflict with himself. Possibly, yes, there are personal things. He came from an aristocratic family which had been very sort of remarkable in things like military service. You know, one of his forebears had fought with the Duke of Wellington and, you know, and had been had distinguished himself on the battlefield. So to have been born an artist, gay, you know, somebody who had no interest in in the kind of values of his own family, shooting, riding, you know, dogs, all that sort of thing, farming, horse breeding. I think that set up a conflict early on. And I think he thought of himself as a kind of medium. I can't tell you, you know, I can't put my finger exactly on what drove him. He was driven. Why he was driven, does one know that?
There's that incident that you describe in your book where his father throws him out of the house.
Yes.
And when I was reading the book, I felt that this was a very decisive moment.
Yes, I think he was a very proud man, and the fact that he'd virtually been disowned because the father was already horrified that he showed sort of artistic tendencies. But when he showed homosexual tendencies, he flipped. And this is a formative story for him. He was sent to Berlin with this friend of the family's who was a very sort of military, manly sort of fellow, and they went off to Berlin together, and Francis said the first thing that happened was that the two of them went to bed together. So, these plans to make a man of him, so-called man of him, a sort of, upstanding heterosexual and knock this gay nonsense out of him, failed spectacularly. And he told that story with a sort of, with hoots of laughter. But you could see he'd been very, very deeply wounded by that whole rejection. Later, the father died, and I think he then became quite successful before his mother died, and so, in a sense, that repaired some of the damage. But he was touched to the quick by that.
Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question before Michael finishes? Okay.
No more goals?
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thanks.